The man known to history as King Edward III was born on the 13th of November 1312 at Windsor Castle in the English county of Berkshire. His father was Edward II, King of England, Lord of Ireland, and Duke of Aquitaine in France, who had succeeded his father, the imposing Edward I, otherwise known as Edward Longshanks, in 1307, when he was just 23 years of age. While Edward II had produced a son around the time of his accession. This child, Adam Fitzroy, was illegitimate, and as a result, the birth of the future Edward III in 1312 was greeted with great joy, as he secured the royal succession. Edward III's mother was Queen Isabella, the daughter of the King of France, Philip IV. Born in 1295, she grew up at the various French royal palaces around Paris, before being married to Edward II in January 1308, when she herself was just 12 years of age and only a few months into what would become Edward's highly tumultuous reign. The England into which the future Edward III was born in 1312 was experiencing great instability. Edward I had created one of the most powerful kingdoms in Europe. In his lengthy reign between 1272 and 1307, he completed the English conquest of Wales, intervened in Scotland, and extended English rule across the Irish Sea in Ireland. He also reformed the judiciary and administration to complete a process whereby England became the most centralized state in Europe of the High Middle Ages. However, the formation of this highly centralized and expanded English state under Edward Longshanks presented a major problem following his death in 1307. His son, Edward II, was a weak ruler, one who placed enormous power in the hands of a series of favoured individuals throughout his 20-year reign, a practice which created great resentment amongst the English lords and political community. The first of these favourites, Piers Gaveston, had established a close relationship with Edward in around 1300 when they were both still teenagers. It is still widely debated whether or not the relationship was sexual in nature, but upon Edward's accession in 1307, Gaveston was granted immense powers. He was eventually made first Earl of Cornwall and granted many offices. However, his behaviour highly offended the nobility, and the king was forced to temporarily exile him to Ireland, where he served as the royal viceroy, and ultimately, having returned to England from one such exile, he was, in the summer of 1312, killed by two senior English nobles, the Earl of Lancaster and the Earl of Warwick. This happened just months before the future Edward III's birth at Windsor Castle, but the years ahead did not see any improvement in the circumstances of Edward II's rule. In the course of the 1310s, the king began displaying a similar partiality to that which he previously showed to Gaveston towards Hugh Despenser, the son and namesake of the Earl of Winchester. As the Despenser family rose in power in the years ahead, the English nobility's opposition to Edward II's rule increased ever further. Additionally, Edward I's gains in Scotland were overthrown in 1314, when the English were heavily defeated by a Scottish army led by Robert the Bruce at the Battle of Bannockburn. As if all this were not bad enough, a famine gripped England in the mid-1310s. Thus, the England the future Edward III was living in during his infancy was experiencing great unrest, in large part owing to the poor governance of his father. Surprisingly little is known about his upbringing, but young Edward would have been totally oblivious to the state of the country at the time he was a young man. Somewhat curiously, he was never made Prince of Wales, as nearly all direct heirs to the throne of England since the late 13th century have been. Instead, he bore the honorific title throughout his youth of Earl of Chester. A separate household, independent from that of the king and queen, was established for Edward, and it was this which he was raised in. Edward was also joined by several siblings in his youth. His brother John was born in August 1316, followed by two sisters, Eleanor and Joan, in 1318 and 1321. Edward may have been partially educated by Richard Berry, a distinguished scholar of 14th century England, but in any event, his education and upbringing would have centred more on the outward physical world rather than the mental world of books. He learned to read and write English and French, but he was only ever possessed of a rudimentary ability to write Latin. He may also have learned some Flemish and German, but if the evidence of Edward's later life is anything to go by, his primary concerns in his youth would have been horsemanship and skill in arms. This, after all, was the high Middle Ages, when a king's ability to lead his people in war was of more consequence than his knowledge of the minutiae of government administration. As he neared his 10th year, the political situation in England reached breaking point. In 1321, a civil war broke out in England, triggered in large part by the king's ongoing support and lavish favour bestowed on the Despencer family and their allies. This revolt was led by Thomas, Earl of Lancaster, a first cousin of the king's, and one of those who had brought down Piers Gaveston in 1312. Although the king successfully snuffed out this rebellion the following year in 1322 and Lancaster was executed that March, the tensions did not end there. Hugh Despencer was now ascendant within England, but he increasingly had a new enemy in the Queen herself. Isabella had always resented her husband's favourites, but she had not clashed with Gaveston, but with Despencer. In the 1320s it was different. The Queen could not see eye to eye with her husband's favourite, and as the months went by, this increasingly drove her against her husband, and soon a showdown would occur. Ultimately, it was events in France which brought the political instability which had characterised Edward II's entire reign to a conclusion. The kings of England had held possessions in France since the time of the Norman conquest of England in 1066. England's conqueror at that time was William, Duke of Normandy, ruler of a large stretch of northern France. The 2 centuries that followed saw this continental empire increase to include further regions in the southwest of the country, including the Duchy of Aquitaine, and then decline, such that Normandy and other lands were lost. By the early 14th century, the kings of England held only the Duchy of Aquitaine in France. This was a personal possession of the English Plantagenet monarchs rather than a constituent part of the English kingdom. Moreover, because the duchy was a constituent part of the French kingdom, Edward II theoretically owed fealty to the King of France, and until his death in 1314, this was Isabella's father, Philip IV. But thereafter, a series of brief reigns followed, finally stabilising in January 1322 with the accession of Charles IV, Isabella's brother. It was this familial tie between the new French king and the English queen which provided the first stirrings of Edward II's downfall in the mid-1320s. Shortly after Charles's accession in France, in 1323, a dispute arose in Aquitaine, which saw an official of the French king hanged by the seneschal of the duchy, Edward II's senior representative there. In response, Charles IV invaded the duchy, an action which now led to Hugh Despencer to have Isabella arrested in England as a French alien in the country. Back in France, Charles IV responded to news of his sister's imprisonment in her adopted home by sending an emissary to Edward II in England, recommending that Isabella should be sent to France as his ambassador to undertake peace negotiations. It was an unorthodox arrangement, but one which the English king consented to. Isabella left for France in March 1325. This was the beginning of the end for Edward II. In France, Isabella came into the orbit of Roger Mortimer, an exiled English lord around whom a faction of Englishmen opposed to Edward II and the Despensers had coalesced in France. The Queen and Mortimer would soon enter into a relationship. More significantly, in September 1325, the young Edward, Earl of Chester, the future King Edward III, was dispatched to France. Why Edward sent his 12-year-old son to continental Europe is still something of a mystery. The most likely explanation is that he was unwilling to travel to France himself and appear before Charles IV as part of the peace negotiations, during the course of which he would have been required to pay homage to Charles, a fellow king, but one who Edward was technically a subject of as Duke of Aquitaine. Accordingly, Edward seems to have hit on the idea of transferring the Duchy of Aquitaine to his 12-year-old son, as a way of avoiding acknowledging his subordinate position to the French king. Whatever the reasons, it was a dreadful strategic error. With the young Edward in France, the anti-Despenser faction of English nobles at the Gallic court in Paris, led by Isabella and Roger Mortimer, now had a viable contender to the English throne to present as a figurehead for a revolt. The error was soon realized in England, where the Despensers and the king sent a command to send the young Edward back home, but Isabella refused this. Thus, by the end of 1325, many of the necessary conditions were in place for Isabella and Mortimer to attempt to overthrow Edward II's regime and the Despensers in England, but Isabella's brother was reluctant to help. For all that Charles IV had been willing to help Isabella during her predicament in England, he drew the line at sponsoring an invasion of England. Accordingly, in the summer of 1326, Isabella, Mortimer, and their supporters, with the young Prince Edward in tow, headed for Hainault, a small principality near what today is the border between France and Belgium. There, Isabella came to an agreement with the Count of the territory, William I, that in return for military aid she would marry Prince Edward to William's daughter Philippa. He agreed and provided Isabella and Mortimer with several hundred men. This small force was ultimately enough. In late September 1326, Isabella, Mortimer, and about 700 men landed in Suffolk. In the weeks that followed, support for Edward II simply evaporated throughout England. Years of resentments at his reckless rule and the undue favour he had shown the Despensers suddenly burst forth. Most critically, the City of London declared for Isabella and Prince Edward. In mid-November, the king was apprehended in South Wales and placed under arrest at Kenilworth Castle, while the senior members of the Despenser family were captured and quickly put to death. Thereafter, the end of Edward II's reign was concluded with a relative degree of peaceful action. On the 13th of January 1327, Parliament resolved that Edward II had to be deposed in favour of his son and namesake. The resolution was put to the king at Kenilworth, and in tears he agreed to abdicate on the 20th of January. Prince Edward was accordingly proclaimed as Edward III, King of England, Lord of Ireland and Duke of Aquitaine, in London on the 25th of January. A week later, he was formally crowned at Westminster Abbey. All of these actions were undertaken in the name of young Prince Edward, who had just turned 14 in November 1326. There is no doubting that Edward was little more than a pawn at this stage, and that power in England now rested in the hands of his mother Isabella, her lover Roger Mortimer, and their followers. It had been agreed by Parliament in January that the young king would rule in conjunction with a council consisting of 4 bishops, 4 earls, and 6 barons of the realm. But this arrangement was quickly sidelined by Isabella and Mortimer. The pair would effectively rule England for the 3.5 years that followed. A number of problems confronted the realm during these early days of Edward III's reign. The most pressing was the status of the former king, Edward's father. In the late spring of 1327, he was moved to Berkeley Castle in Gloucestershire. However, a more lasting solution needed to be found. Isabella and Mortimer's regime was quickly creating unrest, particularly owing to dissatisfaction at the power Mortimer now exercised, and this unrest was coalescing in some circles around the idea of freeing the former king and reinstating him on the throne. A final resolution to the matter was reached on the 21st of September 1327, when the man who had ruled England for 2 decades as Edward II was discreetly murdered on Isabella and Mortimer's orders at Berkeley Castle. An arguably even greater problem confronted the new regime to the north. Seeing the instability which the overthrow of Edward II had created as an opportunity, the Scots, led by Robert the Bruce, had begun a series of raids into northern England and the Crown's possessions in Ireland. Thus, in the summer of 1327, the young King Edward III undertook his first military campaign into the north. This has become known as the Weardale Campaign, after the River Wear, where so much of it occurred and played out in July and August 1327. During the course of it, James, Lord Douglas, in association with the Earls of Mar and Moray, led a contingent of perhaps as many as 10,000 Scots south into northern England. Meanwhile, Isabella and Mortimer, as the newly ascendant power in England, saw the possibility of a successful campaign against the old enemy of Scotland as a good means of legitimising their new hold on power in young Edward's name. Thus, in mid-July 1327, they headed north from York with their own forces to engage Douglas and the Scots. 2 weeks of jostling now occurred between the two sides as they manoeuvred around northern England, trying to track each other's location and gain a tactical advantage before a standoff occurred near the River Wear for 3 days. Finally, on the night of the 3rd of August and into the early hours of the 4th, the Scottish attacked the English camp, penetrating to the very centre of the English royal encampment. In this moment, young Edward came exceptionally close to being captured by Douglas's troops, but although the ropes of the tent itself were cut, the young monarch remained unharmed and uncaptured. This was the peak of the Weardale Campaign. The Scottish attack was pushed back at its most dangerous, and although several further days of toing and froing ensued, ultimately the Weardale Campaign was inconclusive, and early in 1328 the regime was forced to stabilise the northern border by agreeing to the Treaty of Northampton, whereby Edward renounced the English crown's claim to the throne of Scotland and acknowledged Robert the Bruce as King of Scotland. However, the campaign and the nearness of his capture had sparked in Edward a desire to master the art of war. Never again would he find himself so defenceless in the face of an enemy on the field of battle. To compound matters, with the relative failure of the Weardale Campaign, a diplomatic incident which would have consequences which could not have been foreseen at the time erupted in February 1328. On the first day of that month, the French king, Charles IV, Isabella's brother, died. He had only daughters as his issue, and since it had been decided that a woman would not succeed him, this brought the direct line of the Capetian kings of France to an end, having ruled the country since the late 10th century. There were just 2 candidates to succeed Charles IV. Firstly, Edward III of England, who had the best claim as a grandson of Philip IV, Isabella's father, the long-ruling King of France from 1285 to 1314, and secondly, Philip of Valois. However, Edward's claim was never given real consideration in France, where the thought of a foreign monarch ruling France jointly with England was not considered tolerable by the French nobility. Consequently, the claim of Philip of Valois, a direct descendant of Philip III of France, who had ruled between 1270 and 1285, was favoured. He was formally proclaimed as King of France on the 1st of April, 1328, and crowned at Rheims Cathedral as Philip VI on the 29th of May. It is important to remember, when assessing the events which followed, that Edward did have the better claim to the French throne through his mother. Moreover, as a king himself already, he regarded Philip as a social inferior, one who was merely a count. This sense of his own divine right to rule and superior claim would instill in Edward a great desire to emerge victorious from the coming conflict. In the interim between Philip's accession and his coronation at the end of May, a deputation arrived in Paris sent by Isabella and Mortimer to protest at Edward's exclusion from the succession. However, despite their remonstrations, the French would have none of it. Eventually, after months of objections, Edward, by now 16 years of age, travelled to France in the spring of 1329 and paid homage at Amiens Cathedral to Philip VI as his subject as Duke of Aquitaine. On the surface, this was an end to the matter, but the dispute over the succession would prove much, much more extensive than the apparent show of acceptance in 1329 suggested. While these storms were brewing with both Scotland and France, Edward was growing and developing his own independence. In November 1327, he had been married by proxy to Philippa of Hainaut, in line with the agreement Isabella had reached with Count William of Hainaut in return for his support in overthrowing Edward II in 1326. However, while Edward had been willing to follow his mother's lead on this and many other matters in 1327 and 1328, by 1329 he was becoming his own man and was less willing to allow the realm to be governed by his mother and Mortimer. That year, allies of the young king sent secret communiques to the papacy in Avignon, where a rival papacy to that in Rome had been established. These messages alerted the Avignon papacy that the king was not able to rule in his own right. Matters came to a head in 1330. Enemies of Mortimer's had begun to spread rumours by now that Edward II was still alive, and a plot was discovered to launch a rising in the old king's name, led by his half-brother, the Earl of Kent. However, what really spurred the young king to action were rumours that Isabella was pregnant with Mortimer's child. Concerns were now raised by Edward's advisers, notably a close confidant, William Montague, that a plan might be undertaken by Isabella and Mortimer to usurp the throne from Edward. In this scenario, Mortimer, who was still married to his wife of nearly 30 years, Joan, would divorce her, then marry Isabella, and the pair would place their own child on the throne. After a confrontation at Nottingham Castle in mid-October 1330, Edward elected to act. On the night of the 19th of October, the young king, still a few weeks shy of his 18th birthday, along with Montague and a dozen or so other companions, burst into Isabella and Mortimer's apartments at Nottingham. A scuffle ensued, in which a number of their attendants were killed before the king had his mother and her lover arrested. A parliament was summoned in the days that followed, and an announcement made to the political nation that henceforth Edward would rule in person. Mortimer was dispatched to London, where he was accused and convicted without trial of various high crimes and misdemeanours. On the 29th of November 1330, he was the first individual to ever be executed at Tyburn, the site of a great many political executions in England in the centuries that followed. Edward spared his mother, But her political career was over. In the aftermath of Mortimer's execution, she was packed off to Windsor Castle, where she is rumoured to have suffered a partial nervous breakdown. She remained there under house arrest until 1332, before being allowed to retire to Castle Rising in Norfolk. Here she led an expensive but largely sedentary life for a quarter of a century. Her family retained contact with her, and occasionally there were even talks of her travelling to France, but Edward evidently balked at allowing this to a mother who had favoured Mortimer over her own son in the first years of his reign. She became increasingly pious later in life, and became a nun of the Order of St. Clare shortly before her death on the 22nd of August, 1358. With his mother and Mortimer now out of the way, Edward III was free from late 1330 onwards to begin ruling in his own right, just as he turned 18 years of age. The years ahead would see many triumphs. While England had endured a quarter of a century of nearly constant turmoil owing to Edward II's weak rule and then the usurpation of the throne by Mortimer, Edward's reign would see England's power restored and expanded. Under his leadership, the country would ascend to a height unparalleled at any other time in the medieval period. This expansion of English power began in Scotland in the aftermath of the Treaty of Northampton, agreed early in 1328 between King Robert of Scotland and Mortimer and Isabella on Edward's behalf. Robert had agreed to accept the territorial claims of several English border lords to lands in southern Scotland, notably Henry Percy and Henry Beaumont. However, little was done to actually convey ownership of the lands in question to these lords of northern England by Robert, nor was that state of affairs remedied by the minority government which ruled Scotland from 1329 onwards, following Robert's death and the accession of his young son, David II. As a consequence, these lords began to agitate to acquire these lands in the early 1330s. Known as the Disinherited, they now began conspiring to overthrow the Bruce line in Scotland by supporting once again the Balliol claim to the Scottish monarchy, the family which had been championed by Edward's grandfather, Edward Longshanks, over 30 years earlier. Thus, Edward Balliol, the rival claimant to the Scottish throne, was brought over from France by the Disinherited lords, led by Henry Beaumont. Simultaneously, they petitioned Edward III for permission to undertake an invasion of Scotland, which was refused, although perhaps with enough implicit support for their actions that the Disinherited now elected to launch their own military action independent of the king. In the summer of 1332, these lords launched a naval expedition from Yorkshire, which landed at Kinghorn in Fife in eastern Scotland. Proceeding inland, they won a crushing victory over the Scots at the Battle of Duplin Moor on the 11th of August 1332. The figures are very imprecise, but perhaps as many as 5,000 Scots were killed, with very minimal losses for the forces of the Disinherited and the Balliols. That year, Edward Balliol was crowned as King of Scotland, thus setting in motion the Second Scottish War of Independence, which would last for a quarter of a century. Edward had not directly supported the Disinherited and Balliol in their invasion of Scotland, but a decision now needed to be made on his stance towards the usurper. At a parliament in England which convened at Westminster in September 1332, it was quickly suggested to Edward that the Treaty of Northampton, agreed in 1328, should be scrapped and Balliol's claim to the throne of Scotland acknowledged. In order to gain Edward's support, Balliol even let it be known that he was willing to concede that Scotland would be a fief or vassal state of the English crown and would pay homage to Edward III. These offers aside, Edward was reluctant to commit himself to a potentially lengthy war in Scotland, but his hands were forced early in 1333 when Balliol was pushed into northern England, having suffered a military reverse at the Battle of Annan in December 1332. This set of circumstances now required Edward to throw his full support behind Balliol. The English Parliament and the government, including the officers of the Exchequer and the courts, were moved to York, where they would remain for the next several years as the young king sought to reimpose English control over Scotland, which his grandfather had been able to establish many years earlier, but which had evaporated under Edward II's ineffectual rule. It is an indication of the single-mindedness and clarity of purpose with which Edward III pursued his goals throughout his reign that he simply relocated the organs of English government to the north of the country, once he committed himself to the war in Scotland. The first action to be taken was to try to seize the border town of Berwick, which was a part of Scotland at the time. A siege was initiated by Balliol, with Edward's support in March of 1333. The king arrived himself to campaign on the border in the early summer, by which time the garrison and townspeople had made it clear to the government of David II to the north that they would surrender if they were not provided with military support by mid-July. The response to this ultimatum from the townspeople of Berwick would lead to the first of Edward III's many great military victories. The guardian of Scotland during David II's minority, Sir Archibald Douglas, now assembled a significant army of upwards of 20,000 men and advanced southwards to engage Edward's forces. They clashed on the 19th of July 1333 at Halidon Hill, some 2 kilometres to the northwest of Berwick. Edward III started the Battle of Halidon Hill heavily outnumbered. The English army consisted of less than 10,000 men, while Douglas led approximately twice this amount to Berwick. However, what Edward lost in numbers was partially made up for in strategic positioning. The king had occupied Halidon Hill specifically because it dominated the surrounding region, and he had resisted all temptations to move, even when Douglas raided further south into northern England in the days leading up to the battle. The English were also possessed of superior military abilities, which would benefit Edward not just at Halidon, but many other times in the years to come. Paramount here was the use of the 6-foot-long longbow, which could deploy volleys of iron-tipped arrows that penetrated chain-mail armour in rapid succession. This was a much more effective projectile than the slow, cumbersome crossbows that were the mainstay of most European armies in the early 14th century. The widespread use of the longbow was just one component of the military revolution which Edward III was responsible for in the mid-14th century. The battle at Halidon Hill commenced at about midday. Although numerically superior, the Scots were required to advance up Halidon Hill, where Edward's armies occupied the high ground. It would have been advisable for Douglas to have never tried to engage Edward while he maintained the high ground. But with the ultimatum given by Berwick to the Scottish government about to expire the next day, Douglas had little option but to try to relieve the town before it surrendered to the English besiegers. The result was an utter rout. The English longbow was used to devastating effect to decimate the Scottish armies as they attempted to advance up the hillside. Eventually, the Scottish forces broke, and the English, led by Edward, advanced downwards themselves, chasing the fleeing Scots towards the sea. By the end of the day, thousands of Scottish troops were dead, perhaps as many as half of Douglas's army of 20,000, while Douglas himself and 5 Scottish earls lost their lives during the battle. Halidon Hill was an immense triumph for Edward, one of the most substantial victories ever won by an English force against the Scots. It also began developing Edward's reputation throughout Europe as a very formidable military commander, Moreover, English arms were now in the ascendant, where previously English armies had been regarded on the continent as distinctly inferior to their counterparts in France and elsewhere. Politically, the victory placed Edward in an extremely advantageous position in Scotland. Berwick quickly surrendered, and a number of Scottish magnates paid homage to the English king in the days and weeks that followed. More pressingly, Balliol was restored to the Scottish throne, and in February 1334 he agreed to surrender 8 counties, constituting the entirety of southern Scotland below the Firth of Forth and the Solway Firth. Then, in June 1334, Balliol paid homage to Edward as his liege lord at Newcastle. David II and his followers fled to France, completing a whirlwind campaign in which Scotland had been almost entirely brought under English control in 18 months. Thus, by mid-1334, the northern frontier seemed to have been secured in a way which it had not been since the days of Edward Longshanks, but where Edward III succeeded, his erstwhile ally Edward Balliol seemed to constantly be found wanting. No sooner had Edward reinstated him in Scotland than Balliol managed to provoke another revolt in the summer of 1334. He was quickly forced to flee Scotland again, once again leading Edward to intervene on his behalf late in 1334 and into 1335. In 1336 he would even campaign into the Highlands, but his encroachments continued to generate resistance. By 1337, Scotland remained somewhat unsecured and the war would drag on for many years to come. Yet there is little doubting the overall success of Edward's policies towards Scotland in the 1330s. He put England on a surer footing in the north than it had been for 30 years, and secured territorial concessions along the border. Most significantly, he captured Berwick, which would remain an English stronghold on the Scottish border henceforth, except for a brief period in the 15th century. Moreover, Edward might well have gone on to establish an even greater control over Scotland, had it not been for other affairs in 1337. The distraction would come from France, and the fallout would have consequences for both England and France, which would reverberate for over 100 years. The causes of what has come to be known as the 100 Years' War lay in the earlier death of Charles IV in 1328 and the end of the Capetian dynasty in France. As we have seen, Charles's death led to the accession of Philip of the House of Valois as Philip VI of France in the spring of 1328. In reality, Edward had a better claim to the throne of France, but the French nobility had quickly elected to support Philip's accession, being unwilling to have an English foreigner rule them. Isabella and Mortimer had reluctantly accepted this state of affairs and sent Edward to France in 1329 to pay homage to Philip in his role as Duke of Aquitaine. However, the matter did not end there and would be resurrected in the years ahead once tensions created an opportune moment for the issue of the succession to be revisited. In many ways, it was the war in Scotland which created the opportunity for Edward to renew his claims in France. France and Scotland were perennial allies throughout the late medieval period, this old alliance being formed out of their mutual antagonism with England at various times. It is unsurprising, then, to find that David II and his advisers had fled to France following Edward's victory at Halidon Hill in 1333. Over the next few years, as Edward attempted to fully conquer Scotland, Philip VI of France offered substantial support for David's cause. This peaked in 1336, when an enormous French invasion of Scotland was mooted, but Edward was able to stave off the possibility of this by devastating the coastal regions of Scotland, burning crops, and rounding up livestock. No French army could land there if it would not be able to find food to sustain itself in the weeks that followed, and so the invasion was called off. Other controversies led to a further deterioration in relations between France and England in the mid-1330s, notably the refuge that Edward provided to Philip VI's cousin and mortal enemy, Robert, Count of Artois, in England, but in the end it was the simplest route towards the eruption of conflict which caused the 100 Years' War. Edward's most vulnerable territory lay in France itself. On the 24th of May 1337, Philip VI formally announced that he was confiscating the Duchy of Aquitaine from Edward. Late that summer, the Count of Eu was sent into the Gascony region with an invasion force, which devastated the countryside but did not seize the duchy's main town of Bordeaux from the English there. This invasion constituted the first military action of a war that would last for over 100 years. Once the war was entered into in 1337, Edward and England were immediately faced with a tactical problem. Aquitaine was located in the southwest of France and was relatively difficult to supply from England. As a result, Edward's strategy from the very inception of the war was to strike back at the French by attacking Philip VI's possessions directly across the English Channel in northern France, and to use territorial gains here as a means of pressuring the French monarch into ceasing his attacks on Aquitaine. Yet there were problems with his methods too. As he had done in Scotland recently, Edward would try to attempt to burn and pillage the countryside of France as a means of forcing the French to the negotiating table and gaining a strategic advantage. But his approach may have been more counterproductive than anything else. This type of scorched earth policy could often have the direct opposite result, instead instilling a hatred of Edward and his armies amongst the common people of the regions they were brutalizing. As such, it did not serve to win over these areas, but actually made them more solidly loyal to the French in the long run. Even this strategy, though, had its drawbacks, principally in terms of the logistics of transporting an army to northern France. By the mid-14th century, the English merchant fleet was substantial, but the ships of the time were small, and it would prove highly difficult to transport an army of the size Edward would need to gain military victories in northern France. This was the problem which Edward faced in 1337 upon the outbreak of war with France. The solution which presented itself mirrored a strategy which Edward's grandfather, Edward I, had employed in the 1290s. He looked for support amongst the many princes and rulers of the Low Countries and in Germany. Hence, in the summer of 1337, the young king, still just 24 years of age, dispatched the Bishop of Lincoln, Henry Burghersh, and his close ally, William Montague, recently ennobled as the Earl of Salisbury, to Europe. Alliances were quickly negotiated in the weeks that followed, with Hainaut, Gelders, and Brabant in the Low Countries, and most significantly with Louis, Duke of Bavaria, the current Holy Roman Emperor. Overall, Burghersh and Montague were able to acquire commitments from these rulers to provide approximately 7,000 troops to aid Edward in France, as well as shipping and other logistical support to bring the 10,000 men which Edward intended to bring across to France himself, meaning that a force of nearly 20,000 men would be brought into the field in northern France. Yet these alliances came at a cost. Louis and the other princes had been promised substantial financial subventions from England to pay for the mobilization of their armies. These amounted to £124,000 alone by the end of 1337, a very considerable sum for its time, which amounted to several times Edward's annual income. Therefore, Edward was forced to borrow heavily from the merchant banking families of Italy in the opening stages of the war to pay for the alliance he had created. New taxes were also introduced in England, and Parliament was persuaded to vote Edward an extensive subsidy or one-off payment. This latter development was significant. though some accounts tend to view the manner in which kings such as Edward III and earlier his grandfather Edward I had recourse to Parliament for subsidies and financing as a self-indulgent use of the Parliament, such recourse was actually crucial to the development of the English parliamentary system. It was always understood in late medieval and early modern times that parliaments were called when the king or queen of the day needed funding from the political nation, and the political nation in return could express its grievances and requests to the monarch. Edward's use of Parliament in this way actually facilitated the gradual development of the Mother Parliament in the 14th century. Eventually, Edward set sail with his armies from England on the 16th of July 1338 and passed Antwerp in the days that followed with nearly 5,000 men. A meeting followed on the 5th of September at Koblenz, on the River Rhine in Germany between Edward and Louis of Bavaria, at which the Holy Roman Emperor appointed the English king as Vicar General of the Empire, a significant title which theoretically put the military resources of the entire empire at Edward's disposal. With this title in place, and his armies largely assembled in the Low Countries, Edward was finally in a position to take the field in northern France in the spring of 1339. However, this first year of active military campaigning brought with it some frustration, as Philip VI refused to engage Edward in direct combat. An engagement at La Capelle in northeastern France in October was the closest they came to meeting on the field of battle, and this proved a largely abortive clash. Perhaps it was owing to his frustrations at this first year of military campaigning that Edward now made the momentous decision to resurrect his claim to the French throne. Up until early 1340, his stated reason for being in France was to defend his possessions in Aquitaine. But this changed in January 1340. The decision may have been due to a new ally of Edward's, Jacob van Artevelde, a native of Ghent, who had become the predominant political figure in the towns of Flanders in what is now modern-day Belgium. Van Artevelde threw Flanders' support behind Edward in 1339 and persuaded the English monarch to resurrect his claims to the French throne, a right which Edward formally expressed on the 26th of January 1340 when he first began using the title and arms of the kings of France. Edward's decision to claim the French throne was perhaps his most famous and enduring act. In a lifetime characterized by innovations and achievements, the monarchs of England would claim the French throne down to 1802. More immediately, it gave England reason to involve itself on the continent in ways which would allow the English state to retain a foothold in France until the middle of the 16th century. Having claimed the French throne at the outset of 1340, the focus of the war shifted that year to the Naval Campaign in the English Channel. Philip VI had been building up an impressive fleet in the early stages of the war, which, with contingents provided from his ally, the Kingdom of Castile in Spain, amounted to just over 200 ships by the summer of 1340. The English fleet was being quickly added to, and by the time a decisive engagement was fought in 1340, it had been brought to approximately 150 ships. The decisive naval engagement of this period of the 100 Years' War occurred at Sluys, off the coast of Flanders on Midsummer's Day, the 24th of June, 1340. Here, the numerically smaller English fleet managed to engage the French ships from relatively close quarters. As a result, the English longbow, which had been used so effectively in Edward's armies since Halidon Hill in 1333, was used to devastating effect. By the evening, it is estimated that as many as 18,000 French mariners and soldiers had lost their lives, and all but 23 of over 200 French ships had been destroyed or captured, while all of the French senior naval commanders had lost their lives. Edward demonstrated here that he was not just a military commander on land, but that he was also able to win substantial victories at sea. Indeed, he had been in the thick of the fighting himself and was wounded by an arrow in the thigh. Sluys was a very considerable victory indeed for Edward. It secured English control over the English Channel for years to come and ensured that the south of England was free from any potential naval attacks throughout the mid-14th century. However, a challenge now faced Edward, which could not be defeated in a land or naval battle. The cost of the war had escalated considerably. Accordingly, in November 1340, a few months after the victory at Sluys, Edward returned in a secretive fashion to England to confront the government, which he had placed in charge of affairs in his absence, on the financial issues. Notably, the Archbishop of Canterbury, John Stratford, was furious at first, but a reconciliation of sorts was eventually patched up between the pair in 1341, as Edward's attention was yet again drawn to Scotland. While the war had been raging in France in the late 1330s and into the early 1340s, events in Scotland had necessarily fallen down the pecking order of priorities for Edward, but the conflict here had never ended. Indeed, David II, by now entering his late teenage years and developing his own independence as a claimant to the Scottish throne, had returned to the country from France in the summer of 1341. Both Edinburgh and Stirling had quickly been seized for the Bruce cause thereafter. These occurrences now required Edward's attention, and in the autumn of 1341 he once again made Scotland a priority, campaigning on the Anglo-Scottish border throughout the winter of 1341 and 1342. Yet, while Edward might have wished to divert his attentions in a sustained fashion towards Scotland, before long the war in France became the ultimate priority again. In April 1341, John III, the Duke of Brittany, the ruler of the Duchy of Brittany, a substantial fiefdom in the extreme northwest of the country, died without a clear heir. The succession dispute which now arose presented an opportunity for Edward to test whether his claim to the title of the Crown of France had any weight in France. To do so, Edward supported the claim of John de Montfort, a relative of the recently deceased Duke through his niece, while King Philip VI of France was supporting the claim of Charles, Count of Blois, to succeed to the duchy. Thus began what is known as the War of the Breton Succession, a major component part of the wider 100 Years' War, and one which would drag on in its own right for the ensuing quarter of a century. In the immediate sense, the war in Brittany offered Edward a good opportunity to continue to challenge Philip's authority in France, one which he exploited expertly in the years ahead. The War of the Breton Succession continued apace into the mid-1340s, and it was this localized conflict which was the pretext for Edward to begin preparing a major new invasion force in England in 1345. It would be the following year before it finally left for France, but when it did, the campaign of 1346 would produce some of the most significant engagements of the entire 100 Years' War, and some of Edward's most famous military victories. The exact goals and purpose of the 1346 expedition to France were kept largely secret while it was being prepared in England early in the year, and indeed it is still not clear if there was a specific strategy in mind from the beginning, or if the approach was eventually decided upon and developed in response to events in France. Whatever the overall plan had been, we know what actually occurred. Edward's army, consisting of between 12,000 and 15,000 men, landed on the Cotentin Peninsula in Normandy on the 12th of July 1346. His goal was to undertake an extensive chevauchée, or military raid, across French territory, a strategic approach which Edward became particularly fond of in France, and which formed another central plank of the military revolution which Edward implemented amongst the English armed forces in the mid-14th century. The campaign was enormously successful in the weeks that followed. The first major strategic victory came on the 26th of July, when the town of Caen in Normandy was seized by Edward. A sack of the city lasted 5 days thereafter, before Edward's forces headed west, the route to Paris now lying open. As substantial as the sacking of Caen had been, though, the main military success of Edward's 1346 campaign occurred a month later. As the English king advanced on Paris, Philip VI was furiously gathering his forces to protect the French capital, and, by mid-August, the French monarch had gathered together an army consisting of well in excess of 20,000 men, which heavily outnumbered Edward's forces, which numbered approximately 12,000 men by the late summer. Meanwhile, Edward had skirted Paris and turned north towards Flanders, where he hoped to combine with some of his erstwhile allies from the Low Countries. Thus, when the two monarchs finally clashed on the 26th of August 1346, it was far to the north of Paris, near Calais, just outside the town of Crécy-en-Ponthieu. The Battle of Crécy on the 26th of August 1346 would prove to be one of the most consequential engagements of the entire 100 Years' War. When word reached Edward that Philip's army was nearby, he had his own forces occupy the high ground on the right bank of the River May as it flowed past the village of Crécy. The use of the high ground had served Edward well at Halidon Hill, and it would do the same here. The English forces were formed into 3 units, one of dismounted close combat fighters led by Edward himself, and these were flanked on either side by 2 divisions of longbowmen. The French attack came late in the afternoon and would prove disastrous. The favoured French projectile weapon of the crossbow proved completely inferior to the English longbow, and a division of French crossbowmen quickly broke under sustained English longbow fire. Philip then attempted to send his cavalry directly up the hill towards the English centre, but, like the Scottish at Halidon Hill, the French cavalry was completely overpowered by sustained longbow fire from the English as they attempted to surmount the high ground. By the time the cavalry charge reached Edward's arrayed close-quarters infantry division, they were already severely weakened. The resulting clash was an enormously bloody affair, with the French suffering many casualties. By the time the French broke off and left the field in defeat towards dawn on the 27th of August, approximately 4,000 French troops had been killed, while just a few hundred of Edward's troops had been lost. If there were any doubt by 1346 of the superiority of the English longbow against continental methods of warfare, and the use of the crossbow as a projectile, the Battle of Crécy dispelled that doubt. It also solidified Edward's reputation as one of the great military commanders of Europe, having comprehensively defeated the French king, despite being outnumbered by nearly 2-1 at the outset of the engagement on the 26th of August. Significantly, Crécy was also notable for the use by Edward's forces of a small number of cannon, the first recorded instance of the use of artillery in a field battle in Western Europe. The immediate implication of Edward's astounding victory at Crécy was that northern France was now largely unprotected. As a result, Edward turned his forces towards the nearby town of Calais and laid siege to it on the 3rd of September. It would take nearly a full year to capture the northern French port, but eventually, on the 3rd of August 1347, it fell. This must surely stand as one of Edward's greatest accomplishments. Calais would remain in English hands for over 2 centuries, only finally being retrieved by the French in 1558. The victory at Crécy and the inception of the eventually successful siege of Calais were not the only major successes Edward's England was enjoying in the late summer and autumn of 1346. While the king was in France, the conflict had continued on England's northern border with Scotland. In the early autumn, David II now attempted to take advantage of Edward's absence on the continent by invading northern England. It would prove to be a catastrophic error. He was encouraged in this by Philip VI, who called on his Scottish ally to honour their alliance by attacking England. On the 17th of October 1346, David II's forces, numbering approximately 12,000 men, clashed with an English force of just slightly over half the number David brought into the field at Neville's Cross near Durham. The English forces, led by Lord Ralph Neville, comprehensively routed the numerically superior Scots. Perhaps as many as 2,000 of the Scottish army's troops were killed, but most ominously, David II was captured by Neville's forces. Thus, by the autumn of 1347, Edward's fortunes were soaring. In France, he had won a stunning victory over Philip at Crécy in the late summer of 1346, and he followed it up a year later by capturing the town of Calais. In Scotland, the De Bruce contender to the throne had been captured, leaving Edward in an extremely powerful negotiating position both in France and Scotland. To consolidate his position, Edward negotiated a 9-month-long truce in October 1347 and set off for England victorious. It was at this zenith of achievement back in England during the winter of 1347 and 1348 that Edward elected to follow through on an idea he had been harbouring since at least 1344. Enthralled by the idea of King Arthur and his Round Table, Edward had long had designs to set up his own Round Table and knightly order, and in 1344 he had even begun construction work on a headquarters for such a knightly order at Windsor Castle. Now, with his military fortunes prospering in both France and Scotland, he elected to implement a version of this scheme. This was to be a knightly order dedicated to St. George. It was named for the sword belt which the knights of the order would carry. Thus was born the Order of the Garter, a chivalric order which remains the most senior order of knighthood in the British honours system down to the present day. The order's emblem is a garter with the motto Honi soit qui mal y pense, which, translated from the Middle French, means "Shame on him who thinks evil of it." The phrase is said to have been uttered by King Edward at court when the Countess of Salisbury's garter slipped from her leg while she was dancing. The king uttered the words as a rebuke to some courtiers who were laughing at the incident, and so his words became emblematic of chivalrous honour. However, the story is most likely spurious, and there is no actual written account of this version of events until the 1460s, over a century after the founding of the order. At the time of its foundation, the Order of the Garter consisted of Edward himself and 25 knights. Many of those who were amongst the founder knights are unsurprising. For instance, Edward's eldest son and namesake, Edward, known as the Black Prince, was one of the first knights, as was Henry, Earl of Lancaster, and several of the most senior nobles of the realm and supporters of Edward's cause, such as Thomas de Beauchamp, 11th Earl of Warwick, Jean de Grailly, Ralph Stafford, 1st Earl of Stafford, William Montague, 2nd Earl of Salisbury, John de Lisle, 2nd Baron Lisle, Bartholomew Burghersh, 2nd Baron Burghersh, John de Beauchamp, 1st Baron Beauchamp, John de Mohun, 2nd Baron Mohun, Thomas Holland, 1st Earl of Kent, and John Grey, 1st Baron Grey. But there were one or two surprising figures among the first Knights of the Garter. In particular, the inclusion of Roger Mortimer, 2nd Earl of March, seems a curious pick. This was the grandson of none other than the attempted usurper of Edward's royal authority in the late 1320s, Roger Mortimer, who was executed at Tyburn in 1330. This Younger Mortimer had been rehabilitated in the early 1340s, in part owing to his friendship with the Black Prince. Rounding out the list of the first members of the Order of the Garter, Sir Hugh Courtenay, Sir Richard Fitzsimon, Sir Miles Stapleton, Sir Thomas Wale, Sir Hugh Wriothesley, Sir Nell Loring, Sir John Chandos, Sir James Audley, Sir Otto Holland, Sir Henry Eame, Sir Sanchez d'Abrichecourt, and Sir Walter Pavely. Many of these individuals had accompanied Edward in his campaign to France in 1346, and it seems relatively clear that the order was created in 1348 in part as a means of memorializing the great victories Edward had won at Crécy and Calais. In tandem with the establishment of the Order of the Garter, Edward began a vast reconstruction of Windsor Castle. Conscious of the propaganda value of an imposing royal residence, Edward oversaw the most significant expansion of the primary royal residence of the High Middle Ages, eventually expending £50,000 on the new complex, the most expensive building project undertaken by any English monarch during the medieval period. And yet, it was just one of many great residences which Edward could hold claim to. For instance, he had inherited Woodstock Palace in Oxfordshire, a vast royal residence in Oxfordshire which King Henry I had built and where the Black Prince was born in 1330. Woodstock would later become the site of Blenheim Palace. However, just as Edward's reign was peaking, it was hit by catastrophe, one which Edward could do nothing to prevent. The bubonic plague, or what is more commonly referred to as the Black Death, in its 14th century iteration, arrived in Europe in 1347, having been carried to the continent from the Black Sea region, where it was hosted in the fleas which lived on black rats. These were transported to Western Europe in 1347 on board the ships of some Genoese merchants who had trading concessions in the ports of the Crimea on the northern shores of the Black Sea. Bubonic plague causes a dreadful illness and death. During the first week of infection, the infected individual develops flu-like symptoms, including a fever, headache, and vomiting. Then, the individual's lymph nodes begin swelling to form what were known in the 14th century as buboes, generally on the neck, armpits, and groin, or where one had been bitten by the fleas which carried the plague. These buboes would eventually break open and gangrene would develop in the extremities of the body, such as the fingers, toes, and the tip of the nose. Death, when it occurred, however, would be due to organ failure, as the disease ravaged the body internally. Estimates of both the population of Europe at the time and the mortality rate of the plague are notoriously imprecise, but it is generally understood that between 1347 and 1351, the Black Death killed as many as 30 million people in Europe, approximately 1/3 of the population of the continent. The plague arrived in England in the late summer of 1348, and the first recorded cases in London occurred in October. Edward was wholly aware of how fatal it could prove, as his 14-year-old daughter, Joan, had succumbed to the disease in Bordeaux in France right around the time that the disease first appeared in England in the summer of 1348. As a consequence, like many other English monarchs after him, Edward left London and spent much of the months that followed in less densely populated areas where this catastrophic plague was circulating less aggressively. This was effectively a form of medieval quarantine. The Black Death caused enormous difficulties in England, not just in terms of the sheer scale of the mortality and suffering inflicted by it, but also in terms of the social and economic disruption the pandemic unleashed. A parliament which had been planned for 1349 was abandoned, and the courts were adjourned for months. Meanwhile, mass graves were dug to bury the dead, and the country began implementing quarantine and sanitation measures, as best it could for a medieval state. Though such measures seem relatively simple by contemporary standards, recent events of the 21st century have highlighted how critical simply quarantining and removing of the still diseased bodies of the dead are to solving any pandemic, and Edward's government was efficient in doing so after the initial onslaught of 1348. The most pressing issue in the aftermath of the first calamitous wave of the disease was the issue of labour shortages. With the population of the continent drastically reduced, a lack of manpower would bedevil the European economy for decades to come. However, this crisis was offset in England through one of Edward's most subtle but significant achievements. In the summer of 1349, a preliminary ordinance regulating labour was issued by the king, and this was followed up on in 1351 with the Statute of Labourers. Through this, the labour market was regulated by fixing wages at their pre-plague level, ensuring that the English economy could continue to function even with a drastic labour shortage in the 1350s. Although it may lack the fanfare of Edward's military victories, the passage of the Statute of Labourers was a highly significant aspect of the reign of Edward III. It stabilised the English labour market in the period of chaos which ensued from the Black Death, and through it, England was the only country in Europe which was able to implement effective labour controls in the 1350s. There is some debate as to efficacy, though, and historians have also pointed to the fact that the statute did create social tensions and unrest as well amongst workers who felt they were being shortchanged in a labour market which was advantageous to them in the aftermath of the plague. Moreover, enforcement of the Statute of Labourers on the local level in England was largely entrusted into the hands of the Justices of the Peace, judicial officers who enforced the laws on the county level. These officers already existed prior to the emergency created by the Black Death, but the 1350s saw them gain greater authority and significance as local officers of the Crown. Hence, Edward not only oversaw the stabilisation of the labour market in the aftermath of the Black Death through the Statute of Labourers, but the method by which this was done saw the office of the Justice of the Peace begin to emerge in its modern form. The Justices of the Peace would occupy an important position in English local government for centuries to come, and the office was exported to many other countries between the 16th and 19th centuries. Further domestic reforms were implemented by Edward in the 1350s to better respond to the crisis brought on by the Black Death. The most noteworthy was surely a considerable reform of the English coinage, which was initiated in 1351. Gold coins were introduced, and a new silver coin called the groat also entered circulation. Edward was no administrator with a penchant for the minutiae of government reform, such as were being carried out in the early 1350s, but his strength in this respect lay in his ability to pick individuals who were well suited to overseeing his domestic policies and delegating authority to them. Paramount here were officials such as John Thoresby and William Shareshull, who oversaw the implementation of measures such as the recoinage in the middle years of the century. The reform of England's finances was especially necessary to maintain the perennial war effort. The wars with France and Scotland had not gone away, but the continent-wide emergency created by the Black Death ensured that the truce which Edward had negotiated with Philip VI late in 1347 was largely maintained through the late 1340s. The death of the French king, Edward's long-standing rival, on the 22nd of August 1350, encouraged Edward to begin aggressively pursuing his claims in France again against Jean II, Philip's son. However, a renewed French alliance with the Kingdom of Castile and Spain, and the presence of a Castilian fleet in the English Channel in the early 1350s, limited Edward's ability to carry out any further invasion of France at this time. In the meantime, the Succession War continued in Brittany as a proxy for the 100 Years' War. As a result of this latter delay and the fallout across Western Europe from the Black Death, no new major campaign would take place in France until the mid-1350s. When it eventually came in 1355, Edward planned a two-pronged invasion, one directly across the English Channel to northern France, beginning in Normandy, with a subsidiary campaign being undertaken to the southwest in Gascony. The latter campaign through Gascony would feature one of Edward's sons in a prominent fashion for the first time. Edward and Queen Philippa had at least 12 children, born at regular intervals between 1330 and the mid-1350s. 9 of these lived beyond infancy, a high ratio for the late medieval period. Of these 9, 5 were sons and 4 were daughters. Edward's heir was his son and namesake Edward, born in 1330 and known as the Black Prince. He would play a significant role in the war in France from the late 1350s onwards, having previously commanded a detachment at Crécy when he was just 16 years of age, and having also been a founding member of the Order of the Garter 2 years later. Indeed, it was the Black Prince who commanded the campaign in Aquitaine in 1355. Of his other issue, Edward's third oldest surviving son, John of Gaunt, so named after the town of Ghent, where he was born in 1340, just 3 months before the Battle of Sluys, was also destined to play a significant role in the 100 Years' War, as well as in England's domestic politics in the last 15 or so years of Edward III's life. The dual expeditions of 1355 did not arrive in France until late in the year. The king himself led this expedition in person across the Channel to Calais in the very later autumn, but news then arrived in France that the Scots had yet again taken advantage of the English engagements on the continent to invade northern England. Accordingly, Edward quickly made his way back across the English Channel, and in January 1356 he led his last military campaign into Scotland, reasserting English control over the border region. As a result of this about-turn in northern France, the Black Prince's campaign to Aquitaine would prove much the more consequential of the 2 English expeditions to France of the mid-1350s. The heir to the throne travelled with roughly 300 ships and several thousand men for southwest France in mid-September 1355, and was at Bordeaux by October. The military campaign season was nearly over by this time, but Edward Jr. made a short foray inland towards Toulouse before retiring back to Bordeaux for what remained of the winter. While the campaigns of 1355 had proved lackluster, that of 1356 was one of the most significant of the 100 Years' War. The Black Prince set out in July on a great chevauchée, an extended military raid through France, proceeding east through central France with a force of approximately 6,000 men. The Black Prince's forces burned several towns and villages, including Bourges, before doubling back towards Bordeaux in late August. It was during this movement that the French King Jean II elected to engage the English army. Jean might well have believed that the Black Prince was an inferior commander compared with his father, and in any event, the French forces numbered over 10,000, holding an extensive numerical advantage over the English. But if John II believed these factors would give him the upper hand, he was sorely mistaken. At the resulting Battle of Poitiers, which took place on the 19th of September 1356, the Black Prince's forces heavily defeated the French yet again, a feigned retreat first throwing the French lines into disarray, and the English longbow once again being used to devastating effect. Perhaps as many as 2,500 French troops were dead by the end of the battle, but most substantial was the capture of Jean II himself. With David II of Scotland still in English custody since the Battle of Neville's Cross 10 years earlier, the kings of France and Scotland were now both Edward III's captives. This placed the English king in a highly advantageous position. He eventually elected to ransom both in return for military, territorial and political concessions. On the 3rd of October 1357, the Treaty of Berwick was reached with the Scots, whereby David II was released after 11 years in captivity. Edward Balliol had relinquished his claim to the Scottish throne in 1356, so Edward III could now have pressed his own claim to Scotland had he wished to, but instead he opted for a more sanguine approach. David II was released in return for a ransom of 100,000 marks, or just under £67,000, but the arrangement ensured Edward's final acceptance of the De Bruce king's suzerainty over Scotland, thus bringing the long Second Scottish War of Independence to a conclusion after a quarter of a century of conflict. The arrangement eventually arrived at in France, in return for Jean II's release, took longer to negotiate. In the interim, the French king was taken to England and held at various locations including the Tower of London, and a preliminary treaty to release Jean and put an end to the war was worked out in London in 1358. Through this, it was agreed that Edward would be acknowledged in his possession of Calais and granted the neighbouring county of Poitiers in the north around the modern-day region of Picardy, while the Duchy of Aquitaine would be expanded to incorporate much of western France. A very sizable ransom would also be paid in return for Jean's release. Yet this draft agreement could not be finalised, and as a result, in 1359, Edward began preparing a new military expedition against France and expanded his demands to include former English possessions in Normandy, as well as control over Maine and Anjou, and suzerainty over the Duchy of Brittany. In return, Edward promised to renounce all of his claims on the throne of France, but the territorial concessions the English king was now seeking would have involved England taking direct possession of almost half of France and virtually the entirety of the north and west of the country. The French could not seriously consider acquiescing to this latest negotiating position, even with their king in English custody. As a consequence, active military campaigning recommenced in the autumn of 1359, when an army of over 10,000 men, commanded by Edward himself, departed across the Channel for Calais. A long and destructive march through eastern and central France followed in the ensuing months, with Edward threatening, though not taking, both Rheims and Paris, although he was unable to win a strategic victory which would have improved his bargaining power at renewed peace negotiations. By the late 1350s, the French were wary of meeting Edward and his English forces head-on, having suffered multiple defeats against English armies which they heavily outnumbered over the past 15 or so years. In the midst of this stalemate, negotiations recommenced in the early summer of 1360. The resulting peace, or Treaty of Bretigny, so named after the town near Chartres where it was negotiated, was eventually ratified by Edward on the 24th of October 1360. Under its terms, Jean II was to be released in return for an enormous ransom of £500,000. Edward was to renounce his claims on the French throne, and in return he would receive the territorial concessions which Jean had agreed to in London in 1358, being Calais, the county of Poitiers, and an enlarged Duchy of Aquitaine. Ultimately, some of the terms of the Treaty of Bretigny would never be ratified. Specifically, Edward was reluctant to relinquish all his claims on the crown of France, and Jean II was reticent about removing all claims he had to suzerainty over the Duchy of Aquitaine. Yet, The treaty was agreed to and would hold for nearly a whole decade. The treaty is typically seen as marking the conclusion of the first phase of the 100 Years' War. If one were to try to evaluate it in these terms, it would have to be concluded that the treaty signified a major victory for England in that same conflict and marked arguably the peak of Edward's reign. England's territorial possessions in France were greater as a result of the Treaty of Bretigny than they would be at any other point during the 100 Years' War. Clearly then, the Peace of 1360 was a major victory for Edward and ensured that during the 1360s the English king could rest easy knowing he was at the height of his powers in France and the Scottish border had been firmly secured with the arrangement reached with David II in 1357. By comparison with the 3 decades which had preceded it, the 1360s were a comparatively tranquil period of Edward's reign. The Peace of Bretigny would last for nearly the whole of the 1360s, and as a consequence, England enjoyed the first period of sustained peace of Edward III's long reign. Given the entirely advantageous footing the country was on by the time the first stage of the 100 Years' War ended in 1360, this was hardly an undesirable situation. On the domestic front, there were a number of important developments during these years. For example, in 1362, with the assent of Parliament, Edward set about reforming the wool staple, the mechanism whereby wool was exported out of England. The goal now was to set up a new staple at Calais for the export of wool to the continent through a single continental port. The initiative had considerable significance, as the English wool trade, arguably the country's greatest export commodity for the ensuing 3 centuries, was largely sold through markets in northern France and, above all, in the Low Countries, through the thriving mercantile centre of Antwerp. For many years to come, after the reform of the staple in the 1360s, in attempting to establish a staple at Calais, Edward was preempting the market demands of the 15th and 16th centuries. Yet, the most substantial domestic reform of the 1360s concerned the English language. When the Normans conquered England between 1066 and the early 1070s, they brought with them the French language and established it as the language of government and the law courts. During the course of the 11th and 12th centuries, a new language developed, a hybrid of Norman French and the Germanic tongue spoken by the Anglo-Saxons prior to the Norman conquest. This English language, known as Middle English, had become the common tongue of the English people by Edward III's reign, but French remained the language of the courts and government nonetheless. Edward attempted to overhaul this. In 1362, a statute of pleading was passed, which ordered English to be used in the law courts. Similarly, when Parliament met in 1363, the opening formalities were conducted in English rather than French for the first time. Consequently, the 1360s saw a number of important advances in the formal adoption of English as the language of government and the courts in England. Elsewhere, the 1360s were also an important period in the governance of the Lordship of Ireland. Because of the focus on France and Scotland during the majority of his reign, Edward had been unable to devote much time personally to Ireland, a country which the English crown ruled about half of in the east, north and south of the island. A number of Irish lordships ruled the western half of the country and continued to challenge the English rule there. Accordingly, in the early 1360s, Edward entrusted the governance of Ireland to his second eldest surviving son, Lionel of Clarence. This appointment bore significant fruit in the years that followed. In 1366, a parliament was held at the town of Kilkenny in the Irish Midlands, in which a series of statutes were promulgated to separate the English from the Irish in Ireland and protect the English parts of Ireland from Irish encroachments. The Statutes of Kilkenny, as they became known, would serve to insulate the English of Ireland from Irish cultural interference in the decades that followed. For instance, the statutes prohibited intermarriage between the Irish and English and put measures in place to prevent the English of Ireland from adopting Irish cultural and political customs. These measures substantially arrested any potential decline of English power in Ireland during the mid-14th century, and in one shape or another formed a major foundational basis of the English lordship of Ireland through to the early 16th century. While the 1360s was a relatively placid period of Edward's reign, the last decade in which he reigned, the 1370s, would bring with it fresh challenges, yet any assessment of Edward III's reign and his legacy must acknowledge that the king was not the central figure in the governance of the realm during the last 7 or 8 years of his reign. We first find references to Edward's health failing in 1369, when he was 57 years of age. He would live on for another 8 years, but there are clear indications that the king was suffering an increasing number of afflictions, both physical and mental, as the 1370s wore on. As with so many instances of illness in medieval monarchs, we cannot be entirely sure what Edward was actually suffering from during his last years, although it seems that the most serious of his maladies might have been caused by a series of strokes which he experienced in the last 8 or so years of his life. These afflictions certainly limited Edward's role in the governance of his realms, but he still played a part, though by the 1370s the day-to-day functions of government were increasingly carried out by his sons and extended family. Nevertheless, some significant events can be tied to Edward even in his final years. Paramount here was the resumption of the war in France. Peace had lasted for the better part of a decade since the settlement of 1360, but this was becoming more and more tenuous as the years went by. Charles V had succeeded his father Jean II as King of France in May 1364. The son was a more aggressive figure who in the years that followed attempted to re-establish the strength of the French monarchy after the bruising it had taken during the 1340s and 1350s. For instance, he entered into a rapprochement with Charles of Naval, the small kingdom on the southern border of France, but more conspicuously, the French king reasserted the suzerainty of the French monarchy over the Duchy of Brittany. The spark for renewed conflict with England came when Charles exploited internal unrest within the Duchy of Aquitaine in 1369 to demand that the Black Prince appear before him. When the heir to the English throne declined to do so, Charles V declared the Duchy of Aquitaine forfeit in an instant, reigniting the dormant 100 Years' War. In response, in the summer of 1369, Edward resumed his claim to the throne of France, which he had agreed to surrender in 1360. Consequently, the war was rejoined just as Edward's health was beginning to deteriorate at the end of the 1360s. This new chapter in the conflict between England and France was a fundamentally different affair to those of the 1340s and 1350s. For one thing, Edward would not lead an invasion of France himself, and the execution of the military campaigns was to be largely carried out by Edward's sons, the Black Prince and John of Gaunt. Notably, in this regard, Edward had intended to lead an expedition to France himself when the conflict first broke out in 1369, but he had to abandon his plans for this, and it was eventually John who commanded this army when it crossed the Channel. Moreover, in this new phase of the war, the conflict between England and France became increasingly mixed up, with a series of civil wars and interstate conflicts in Spain involving the two major powers there, the kingdoms of Castile and Aragon. It is perhaps a reflection on how much the victories of the 1340s and 1350s had been dependent on the dynamic leadership and brilliant generalship of Edward III that in this latest phase of the war, England floundered without the old king's direct involvement. Much of the Duchy of Aquitaine was overrun in the early 1370s, in part because the Castilians, with whom the French had allied, managed to defeat the English at sea off La Rochelle in southwestern France in June 1372. This defeat limited the degree to which English territories on the continent could be resupplied from England. A major campaign was undertaken in 1373 in an attempt to overturn the defeats which English arms had suffered between 1369 and 1372. This great chevauchée, or raid, was led by John of Gaunt and proceeded from Calais south through eastern France and then west to Bordeaux. Although it left much destruction in its wake, it was a strategic failure and failed in its main goal of reimposing English authority in Brittany. As a result, by the mid-1370s, without Edward's leadership to draw upon, the English position in France was much depleted and was largely confined to Calais and the north and the coastal regions of Gascony, including the town of Bordeaux. It was with the English fortunes at this low ebb that Pope Gregory XI offered to broker a peace between the belligerents in 1374. The resulting treaty, known as the Treaty of Bruges, was agreed on the 27th of June 1375. It allowed England time to regroup, but was unpopular at home in large part because the peace had seen the English position in the north of France weakened. Yet it would not last long. The issue of the sovereignty of the Duchy of Aquitaine was not resolved by this latest treaty, and in the months ahead this became a cause for fresh unrest. The English wanted Aquitaine to be freed entirely from French sovereignty, a move which would ensure that the kings of England would never have to pay homage to the monarchs of France again. While Charles V was somewhat understandably reluctant to effectively abandon any claim he had on the duchy, war would quickly resume again around this issue and several others in 1377. But when it did, it would be the task of the government of Edward's successor to oversee it. While the last years of Edward's reign saw some reverses in France, on the home front a number of domestic crises were navigated with admirable skill. These largely concerned the issue of financing a fresh period of war on the continent, and in 1371 and again in 1373, parliaments were called in order to obtain a loan and subsidy from the lords and gentry of England. In both instances, Edward had to make several concessions to the political nation in order to attain the requisite financing, notably by replacing a number of his senior ministers who were churchmen with lay officials. Yet resentment was building about the kingdom's finances throughout the decade, which came to a head in 1376 in a parliament convened just 1 year before Edward's death, known to history as the Good Parliament. This latest assembly was called to provide further financing for the crown. When it met in April 1376, however, it took advantage of the opportunity to lay forth a series of accumulated grievances, particularly with several of Edward's advisers. John of Gaunt also became a target of the Parliament, especially so during the summer of 1376, when the Black Prince died from dysentery on the 8th of June. A relatively amicable series of solutions were eventually worked out, whereby the councillors who had offended the political nation were dismissed and some further reforms implemented. Consequently, the end of Edward's life saw the English Parliament functioning as a means of redress for the English political community in a manner which would break down in later times. That this was avoided, and with it England spared any form of revolt during Edward's long reign, is a testament to the stability of his reign on the domestic front, despite the regular strains of financing extended wars in France and Scotland. However, that stability was fracturing. It would have been apparent to the assembled parliamentarians and nobles in London in 1376 that the king's health was deteriorating sharply. At the age of 64, and after nearly half a century on the English throne, in late September he became seriously ill from a large abscess. Days later, he was making some final amendments to his will in preparation for his impending death, but it did not come. Rather, the old monarch rallied in the weeks that followed. However, early in February 1377, the abscess burst. As a result, his movements were highly encumbered for the remaining months of his life. When he died at Sheen Palace, where Richmond Palace would subsequently be built, near London, on the 21st of June 1377, it was almost certainly from another stroke. He was 64 years of age. He died having achieved so much in his lifetime in a long and influential reign as England's monarch. The most significant chronicler of Edward's reign and the first half of the 100 Years' War, Jean Froissart, wrote stirringly of Edward's death and funeral in his chronicles, an event Froissart lived through himself. On the 21st of June 1377, the gallant and noble King Edward III departed this life, to the deep distress of the whole realm of England, for he had been a good king for them. His like had not been seen since the days of King Arthur, who once had also been King of England, which in his time was called Great Britain. King Edward was embalmed and placed with great pomp and reverence on a bier borne by 24 knights, dressed in black, his 3 sons and the Duke of Brittany and the Earl of March walking behind him, and carried thus at a slow march through the city of London, the face uncovered, to witness and hear the grief of the people. Their sobs and screams and lamentations on that day would have rendered anyone's heart. It was a fitting last journey for one of England's greatest kings. Edward was succeeded by his grandson Richard, the son of the Black Prince, just 10 years old at the time of his accession. Richard II would rule until he was usurped by his cousin Henry Bolingbroke. In 1399, Richard's reign would be characterized by military reverses and mass social unrest within England, the most significant being the Peasants' Revolt of 1381. His reliance, like his great-grandfather Edward II, on a cohort of favourites, aroused widespread discontent throughout the Plantagenet realms and foreshadowed the Wars of the Roses of the 15th century. Consequently, Edward III's reign appears all the more remarkable in retrospect for having been an oasis of stability in the midst of the chaos that otherwise characterized England's politics throughout the 14th and 15th centuries. There is little doubting that Edward was one of England's most substantial and successful monarchs ever. In the 19th century, a generation of historians began to vilify the king and questioned whether his reign could be considered a success. However, this view is problematic, as the writers of the Victorian era attempted to impose their own value systems on the appraisal of Edward instead of assessing the king on his own terms as a late medieval monarch. For a king who was born and lived in warfare, the moral concerns of later generations would have made little sense. Indeed, imposing moral judgments on the actions of people who lived hundreds of years ago is always problematic. More recently, historians such as Ian Mortimer and William Ormrod have successfully restored Edward III's reputation. While there is no denying that Edward's last years saw some setbacks, particularly in France, he was at this time very ill, and power had largely devolved to his sons. When we disregard this latter period, there is no doubting the success of Edward's reign. Under his rule, England reached the peak of its power during the medieval period. At points between the 1330s and 1360s, Edward was not just the ruler of England, Wales, and much of Ireland, but was able to impose his authority fairly thoroughly on Scotland and large sections of northern and western France. Some of the territorial gains were either permanent, as in the case of Berwick on the Anglo-Scottish border, or long-lasting, as in the case of the town of Calais in northern France. The 100 Years' War, which he initiated, was a key component in the eventual formation of England and France into modern nation-states, owing to the manner in which it drew on their administrative and financial resources and fostered a fledgling sense of patriotism through national endeavour. Indeed, when Edward sent requests for men and money around his dominions to fund his campaigns in France, he was effectively commanding his local officials to come up with better ways of taxing the country and exploiting its resources. This is the very basis of the modern nation-state, one which is expertly placed to exploit the resources available to it to the maximum extent possible in the name of government. Much of this territorial expansion was achieved on the back of both Edward's outstanding abilities as a general and the military revolution which he oversaw during his rule. The English longbow made England the military superpower of its day. At Halidon Hill, Crécy, Neville's Cross, Poitiers, and several other battles, English armies consistently managed to defeat French and Scottish armies, which were substantially numerically superior to those commanded by Edward and his nobles. Moreover, an English army was quite possibly the first to utilize field cannon in all of Europe at Crécy in 1346. Nor was Edward's military prowess confined to land. As at Sluys in 1340, Edward demonstrated how effective the English longbow could be, even at sea. Given all this, there is little doubting that Edward III should be viewed as one of the great commanders of English and British military history, a figure who stands alongside John Churchill, 1st Duke of Marlborough, whose command of England's forces during the War of the Spanish Succession in the early 18th century catapulted England to the rank of major powers in Europe, or perhaps even Arthur Wellesley, 1st Duke of Wellington, whose successful prosecution of the Peninsular War in Portugal and Spain, which took place between 1807 and 1814, became the bane of Napoleon's dominance of Europe, while Wellington was also central to Bonaparte's final defeat at Waterloo in 1815. Certainly, Edward III's legacy as a military commander probably surpasses his grandfather Edward I, while he may not have been able to convert his military victories as successfully into political victories. There is little doubting Edward III was a more skilled commander on the field of battle. Edward's legacy should not just be measured through assessing his prowess on the battlefield. In the late 1340s, he established the Order of the Garter, England's highest chivalric order to this day, and in doing so contributed to England being considered the most chivalrous kingdom in Western Europe at the height of the Middle Ages. As a further statement to the world of his rule, he also re-edified and expanded Windsor Castle as a symbol of English royal power. Another lasting achievement was seen in the late 1340s and early 1350s, when Edward successfully steered England through the crisis wrought by the arrival of the bubonic plague in Europe. The Black Death was the greatest crisis faced by Europe during the late Middle Ages. Perhaps as much as a third of England's population died within the space of half a decade, but rather than succumbing psychologically to the onslaught of illness and death which ravaged England in the late 1340s, Edward guided the country through this period by stabilizing the economy through the passage of the Statute of Labourers. Moreover, in strengthening the office of the Justice of the Peace, In order to effectively implement the statute on the local level in England, Edward's government made a lasting contribution to English local administration, one which was subsequently exported to Ireland, North America, India, and Australia in later centuries. Yet, in many other ways, Edward's reign and its success was about long-term nation-building. Parliament became more important during his reign, and he began to use many of the emblems which came to symbolize England itself, notably carrying the Cross of St. George into battle. But perhaps Edward's greatest legacy was in the reorientation of the courts and government to favour Middle English as the language of government and officialdom in England. As a result, in the centuries that followed, when England and then Britain began settling colonies elsewhere all over the world, it was English which was spread globally as the language of England and Britain. There is no doubting the importance of Edward III to all these key developments of the 14th century, making him perhaps England's greatest king. What do you think of King Edward III? Was he England's greatest ever king, and if so, is he unjustly forgotten about today? Please let us know in the comments section. And in the meantime, thank you very much for watching.